Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it. It's good to be with you this afternoon. I'm going to just kind of fairly briefly go through the new policy on steel truss pedestrian bridges. Two things I want to point out. First of all, this new policy is only applicable for design bid build projects. And then second of all, we're really only talking about the steel truss main span of pedestrian bridges. So the rest of the pedestrian bridge is going to be unchanged. Our policy is unchanged, and I'll go into the details of what that means. Oops. Okay, last summer we put out a joint structures design roadway bulletin on June 30th, which set out this new policy for design guidance. In January of 2012, we published this design bulletin into the two manuals. Section 8.7.2 included these design guidance as well as Chapter 10 of the SDG. And then the design bulletin has since been archived. So prior to June 30th, all pedestrian bridges and including the steel truss portion were custom designed up front prior to bid and fully detailed in the bid document. So essentially the EOR was asked to produce a generic design that would be bid. The problem was, of course, that most of these steel truss pedestrian bridges are proprietary. So what was going on is the contractors would, after bid, substitute through the contractor redesign specification a prefabricated option. So the issue here is the wasted work that we were doing up front under the low bid scenario, that we felt like we were obligated to do that. So we went back and looked at it and said, well, this seems to be, let's look at how we can best streamline the process and save that wasted effort. So the new policy is when we have a prefabricated steel truss, once it's specified, we do not include now the superstructure plans for the steel truss prior to bid. The superstructure is actually detailed in the shop drawings after bid by a pre-qualified steel truss pedestrian bridge producer, and I'll talk about where that list is, and there are several producers that are currently pre-qualified in the state of Florida. So, and then the foundation and substructure has to be detailed in the original plans prior to bid by the EOR. So the issue here is you've got several vendors that are going to supply you with a proprietary product after bid, and the EOR has to know what assumed loads that he's going to have to design for in his substructure, because he's going to have to fully detail those in the plans. And then the second part of that is how the fit up of the superstructure would connect to those foundations. And so I'll go into how that process would work. Also, before I go into that, I want to mention that there are exceptions to the rule when, due to project aesthetics, and there's not two acceptable vendors that can produce the truss that you want, then you would fully detail a generic design in the plans. Okay, so this is kind of the exception. And so you detail all the foundation, superstructure, and sub in the plans. And then, of course, like I said, that for all non-steel truss pedestrian bridges, you would design a generic design, and that would include beam pedestrian bridges, or whatever the steel girders, pedestrian bridges, or whatever. You would just design a generic design. So this policy is just specific to steel trusses. Okay. So around BDR 30% plan stage, the way this is intended to work is the EOR would send out an ITB, an invitation to participate to all of the pre-approved pedestrian bridge producers. So this is a notice to them to let them know that a project is coming and that you need some information to design your superstructure or your substructure. And the pre-approved pedestrian bridges, the link is given in the PPM, and you see the link here that lists the pre-approved vendors, and this particular link is maintained by the materials office in Gainesville. So what things to include in the ITP? The invitation to participate cover letter, the project location map, general plan and elevation of the pedestrian bridge itself, the bridge typical section, and the pedestrian bridge data sheet. And the pedestrian bridge data sheet includes things like the intended aesthetics that you want to try to achieve, the project requirements there, and the other necessary project-specific information so that the vendor knows the type of bridge that you're looking for. So what he does is during this period of time, he gets this invitation to participate, and then he needs to come up with the loading for his truss, and so that you can design the substructure. So first of all, he also needs to acknowledge receipt of the ITP package. He's going to have to participate in the project. He basically has to say yay or nay whether he wants to participate. And if he chooses not to participate, then he's not eligible to participate after bid. See, so the onus is on him up front to give this information to the EOR for inclusion into the plans. And then these pedestrian bridge data sheets, the information he provides, including the vendor name, the loads, and the connection details, the interface, if you will, at the bearings, becomes pedestrian data sheets that are included in the contract documents. So the contractor will see the bid documents. He'll know what vendors are participating, as well as the contact information, which will be on the sheet. And then, of course, the project EOR then would design the foundations and substructure components for the worst case loading. He basically envelopes the load, designs the foundation for that loading, and then he's good to go. We went through and looked at the available vendors out there that are pre-approved and the aesthetic options that are readily available. We have currently 5 types that's listed. So any of these 5 types are possible options to be project-specific aesthetics. But there's also an option here for the EOR, if there's special aesthetic requirements of the project, to go back and say, well, here's the list of vendors, contact the vendors, find out if they can produce that aesthetics or as close as they can. There may be some back and forth to come up with, but he needs to confirm that there's at least 2 vendors that can meet those aesthetic requirements. And so that requirement, or whatever aesthetics he's trying to accomplish, needs to be clear in the plans. And then those 2 vendors would be adding the data sheets or more, or however many can based on availability, how many can produce that look, if you will. And so all that information would be put in the plans. And like I mentioned earlier, if the availability is such that not more than 2 vendors cannot produce the aesthetics, then a generic design meeting the project requirements would be included in the plans. And then there's basically a pony through truss and a box truss option as well. So all that information is given to the vendor so that they can do this takeoff to the preliminary design and give the loading to the EOR. And then next, after bid, the contractor's EOR submits signed and sealed shop drawings of the superstructure. quite much like the current or the past practice where they had a contractor redesign. It's really the same process here. It's just we're just eliminating that generic design up front. And that's really, in a nutshell, all I had. I think it's a pretty simple process. It's a little akin to our MSC wall process. So the complication here is that you've got to know the loading up front for designing the substructure. Okay, so and with that, I'd like to turn it over to Gary Rufa. He's an area engineer for Districts 1 and 7 in the Structures Office, and he's going to be talking to us about weathering steel.